Hi, good afternoon. I'm going to talk about food waste. So, when I was a little child, we used to have big and long Christmas lunches. And my grandma gave us a special dessert called marron glacé. She explained to us this was a very valuable and expensive food. So she didn't give us the round shaped ones, but she gave us boxes full of marron glacé scraps. And the question I asked myself at the time was, who was the genius who invented this new product with the same taste actually, but made by scraps? And this made me think that all of our food waste could actually be a product. Let's give value to the food waste. People nowadays spend lots of energy thinking how to recycle the package of products. But what about what is inside the package? When we talk about hunger, about people needing food, why don't we think about this? And I know why. We do not think about this because the plastic, the package, goes in the sea and is very bad for our environment, while, for example, food waste disappears immediately. But we need to be smart. We need to use what we have. I, as a young consumer, for example, would think it's funny to have a new product on my table. For example, pasta scraps from Barilla. So let's give value to the food waste.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Nicolas Dufourcq. I am the CEO of BPI France. So BPI France, for those of you who don't have that in mind, is the French bank for entrepreneurs. It's a mixture of a sovereign fund, the Silicon Valley Bank, huge funds of funds, financing some funds which are in the room, by the way, and at the source of the existence of the French tech ecosystem. So my presence today, thanks to the invitation of my friend Marco Galtieri, is I would say, a way for me to highlight our strategy in food tech. Because as Marco always told me, we think that food tech is the sort of the new internet. It is going to explode, literally. And by the way, what has been achieved here with the Seeds and Chips is something which I think is extraordinary. It should be enhanced and developed and mushroom in diverse European countries. So what do we do as far as BPI is concerned? Just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the efforts that we are pursuing. First of all, we have financed today 500 startups in food tech in France. We allocate every year approximately 1.5 billion euros of loans and equity to agro companies and food tech, which is quite a lot of money. We are following those companies from absolute seed, I would say, angel moment, to very significant financing, like the last one 1 month ago of a company called Insect, in which we decided to invest close to 30 million euros in a round of 110 million. 110 million just on one food tech to build a huge factory in the north of France based on the insect valorization. We are heavily investing in the technology transfer coming from the research of the French universities in food tech. We have partnerships with our colleagues of the Agro Institute of France. Some of them are in the room. I saw them. And the idea going forward in the next 3 years is to organize a snowball of what I described, because those figures may look like significant. We don't think they are enough. We think a lot can be done for a country like France, which is still the first agriculture product producer of Europe. Okay, so we are favoring, you know, the sort of Cambrian explosion of the number of startups in Europe in food tech. We are ready to finance more venture capital funds in France, but also more venture capital funds in Europe dedicated to food tech, provided they invest a little bit in France, but not only, including Israel, by the way. I saw our friends of Jerusalem Venture Partners 1 hour ago. We have invested in this fund because they invest in food tech in Europe. We think really we mean it when we say food tech is the next internet. So what are the big trends of the startups on a bottom-up basis which we see and which we decide to finance? So first of all, you need to know that our philosophy is a philosophy of pure bottom-up. We don't have, preconceived ideas that we should finance this or that, and we are not looking down to the ecosystem. We wait for the ecosystem to come on us and make proposals to us, because we think that the intelligence of the future is in the ecosystem. It has to be collective intelligence, or there is high possibility that the people that you see are looking at the past. So what is the ecosystem of basically France, but not only, because as I said, we finance many venture capital funds in Europe. What is this ecosystem providing to us as proposals? First of all, a lot of proposals of the digitalization of the value chain, of course. Everything which is related to traceability, to total transparency of the components of the food, to platforms building collective intelligence again between producers and distributors, all that. Everything which is the sort of translation to food tech of the world of Facebook, I would say, we finance. And of course, there are a lot of projects. There will be a sort of Darwinian selection between all of them. Some will merge, some will die, but at the end of the day, we can already predict that the digitalization of the value chains is going to accelerate. One of the consequences, by the way, of this acceleration will be that some classical business models of, for example, distribution of intrants to the farmers will be disrupted. There are companies that we follow in France which are, methodically attacking the business model of what we call les coopératives, so the groups of entrepreneurs, which we know are living from the margins that they make on the distribution of entrants. And you have a lot of startups which have decided to bypass all that we support, of course. By the way, we support also the big agro-food companies in their endeavors to modernize themselves and digitalize themselves and so forth. So that's one first chapter, which is digitalization. Then there is a second big chapter, at least in what I know of the French ecosystem, which is animal proteins. Around, again, everything which is linked to the insects. I can cite maybe practically 10 projects. And all those projects have deep industrial consequences, because when you start to be serious, you have to build huge factories, which is why you need huge and patient capital, and there we come. We are not alone, we have private VCs with us, but we are there to ensure that we can be as patient as possible and as necessary for the projects to really be born, I would say. Then third train is, of course, green proteins, but this is not a surprise. Many projects that come to us and that try to answer the needs of the consumers, because basically what are the consumers requesting? They want taste. I say taste with a lot of oxygen. So they want taste. They want security, total security, more and more. So they want absolute transparency. They want meaningfulness, I would say. So they want when they buy something to be able to sort of decipher a story. The story of the product, the story of their relationship to the product. And of course, the green proteins allow for practically all of this. Of course, we can be absolutely transparent on it. There is absolute security, of course, and there is the possibility of a story. So in the booth, you will see here, there is a sample of 10 French startups. You will see most of them which are pushing that kind of innovations. And then the fourth chapter of innovation is which I would call it green biotech, green chemistry, but green biotech. We would call that OGMs. And I have to say, we don't have a lot of projects and startups. We cannot have most of them because of the, legal hurdles that we are facing in Europe. Hurdles which are, of course, legitimate for part of, I would say, that chapter and that question, but sometimes are a clear obstacle to innovation, with unfortunately a consequence, which is that we start to see in that chapter of innovation, which is again green biotech, CRISPR-Cas9 and so forth, transfer of the research centers from Europe to the US or to Israel or to China. So this is a problem. We know we have to face it. We have our voice as BPI, and we have to put it on the table because we start to think that the consequences could be too significant and unexpected for those who imposed those rules at the beginning. So things have to be explained to the people. Maybe on some questions we are too radical, I would say. So to sum up, we finance green proteins, vegetable proteins, a lot of platforms. We finance the open innovation of big agro companies, of which sometimes, by the way, we are shareholders, like Limagrain, like Avril. We finance all the innovation programs of very significant companies that you may know, like Roquette, Soufflet, which are companies which are in the value chain of the agro-business worldwide. All those companies are making 80% of their business outside of France. So all arms dedicated to that food tech revolution. That's what I wanted to tell you. And again, final and sort of red line message, France is totally open to food tech startups. Not only those who settle in France, but those who are financed in Europe by venture capital funds that we also have decided to support because we think that the question is so important that we cannot abide by geographical borders, okay? So overall, that's a message for the ecosystem who's present here. I finish with a sort of global figure to give you an idea of the size of BPI. BPI, we manage 35 billion. So every year, we are in a position to allocate practically 1.5 billion to innovation financing. And every year, we allocate 1 billion to private funds. And we would like part of that 1 billion to be every year allocated to food tech venture. Thank you.
That was a great speech. Thank you, Nicholas. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending this session today. My name is Laura Schulman. I'll be your moderator, the moderator of this panel. I am a food and communications strategist, so I like to tell stories. I'm very excited about the story we're going to talk about today because it's a big one and we have really big brains to talk about how we tackle it. So I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves, give a little 2-minute kind of blurb about who you are and why you're here and what we hope to solve today.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Fabrice de Klerk with EAT and with Biodiversity International. So living in France, in Montpellier, which I think is a fantastic place to be working on food. We didn't pay for this, but we'll try to attract attention to France. I represent the science, policy, private sector interface here. I'm a scientist by background, a geographer and ecologist, and really I think the big piece of work that I'd like to share with you today is the work that EAT has done with the Atlantic Commission on healthy diets from sustainable production systems. And as you saw during the introductions, what we really are trying to flag is the need for a radical, an aggressive, and accelerated food transformation that meets both dietary health needs, but also the environmental needs of the planet. So there's a lot of talk here at Seeds&Chips on environment, the Anthropocene, which Johan Rockström, my colleague, has really helped to shed some light on. we like to call it the Anthropocene, because the challenge that all of you are faced with today is not just reducing meat consumption and climate, but it is biodiversity protection, food security, producing enough food, human health, producing the right food, and doing that with less water, less land, less contamination of our waters, and fundamentally zero land expansion. So I hope we'll be able to talk about some of those challenges, but really again reminding ourselves that it's this multiple challenges that we hope to address, and the role of technology in working with environment rather than replacing environment is one of the questions I hope we'll be able to discuss.
I presented myself.
Good afternoon. My name is Yokohama Nelly. I'm a social entrepreneur based in Lagos, Nigeria. I'm the co-founder of Ace Foods. It's a food company that processes food locally and displaces imports, attempts to address the malnutrition challenges in our region. And I'm also the managing partner of Sahel Consulting Agriculture and Nutrition, which works across West Africa, really addressing policy, value chains, and making sure that we unlock the potential of private sector to solve Africa's food challenges. I'm really excited about this panel because I'm actually working on a book as part of a senior fellowship at Harvard on how you can nourish Africa's 2.4 billion, because in 2050 we'll be 2.4 billion in Africa. And I'm very interested in what we can learn from the rest of the world to leapfrog some of the challenges that the West faces at the moment, and how we can leverage technology and innovation that are homegrown solutions being spurred by the private sector on the continent. I also think governments have an important role to play to create an enabling environment, and I'd like to see how we can learn from other parts of the world as well. Thank you.
You're awesome. Hi everyone, my name is Thomas. I run an organization called Food Frontier Down Under. We are a think tank and industry accelerator for plant-based and cell-based meat, trying to grow the ecosystem in our part of the world and help local stakeholders take advantages of the opportunities that this space presents. We aim for a world where we have a far more diversified protein supply that isn't as reliant on industrial models of animal agriculture as our current system is. And we have a variety of initiatives. We do research and advocacy, but hands-on, we work with startups that are emerging, introduce them to investors, and help grow that ecosystem locally. And as part of that, work with government to ensure a fair regulatory playing field for new emerging companies, and also to advocate for proactive support of the space so that there's both the capital there and the enabling policy to allow this diversification to happen.
Good afternoon. My name is Jack Bobo. I'm the CEO of Futurity, which helps companies to understand the future of food and how to position products in the marketplace. But I came to the topic of food originally from Indiana in the United States, and my family, we grew all of the food we ate. Our garden was probably 4 times the size of this space here. And from there, I went to Africa, where I spent a couple years working in the Peace Corps as a science teacher in a small village. And that introduced me to the larger world of food and the challenges that were around the world. Later, I worked at the U.S. Department of State for 13 years on global food policy, covering Africa, then Asia, then Europe, and then we're running our global biotechnology program. Later, I went to Intrexon Corporation, which is listed in the program, where they work on biotechnology, so we were producing all sorts of products that aren't allowed in Europe. We produced non-browning apples, genetically engineered salmon, cloned animals, and things like that. We were also fighting cancer and other diseases, but we don't talk about those very much. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation because I like to say that people love innovation almost as much as they despise change. And there's no place that people despise change more than in the food they eat. But if we don't change how we produce food, everything will change. So I'm interested in how we're going to get there.
Awesome. You guys are awesome. Well, let's start with that. Change is big, right? And I think, maybe Fabrice, we'll start with you in terms of what the report kind of is starting to vet out. Where do you start? There, especially when you talk about policy, there's different verticals of policy, there's different regions of policy, there's different actions of policy. Where, if you look at everything that you've learned from this really substantial report, where are some places to begin, especially as you look across the diverse perspectives of this group?
Sure. So the recommendations what we try to do with the Atlantic Commission is to set clear universal guidelines for healthy food and sustainable production. Both of those were not a comparison of GMO versus organic or no-till versus conventional, but really trying to say, can we create a set of guidelines that would allow for alignment between a diverse set of stakeholders and actors? And so fundamentally recognizing that if we're going to feed 10 billion by 2050, within environmental limits, that's halting climate change, halting biodiversity loss, maintaining at least 30% water in our river basins, keeping nitrogen phosphorus out of those waters, that there's three main levers that allow us to do that. And one is dietary shifts, one, reducing consumption. In the US, we're consuming 3,800 calories per day versus a 2,800 recommended, so bringing that in line, shifting towards more plant-based foods. That doesn't mean in the absence of meat, but with less meat, particularly for Western consumers. Still room for growth in African and Asian diets, and reducing food waste and loss. So that's really the three big levers, but those do require significant policy action. And what we're finding is that policy can enable, but it can also quite often inhibit. Policy can create lock-ins that make it challenging for innovation to be tested, to be scaled. Policy can also be too specific and reduce diversity of actors in a supply chain. So a lot of the work that we do has been working with policy to try to resolve many of these barriers, and we're finding different opportunities depending on where you're looking. International policy, I think the biggest opportunity has been to get international policy to work across boundaries, to have agricultural policy speak to and work with conservation policy, speaking to and working with health policy. Right now, agricultural policy and health policy are completely unaligned. If we wanted to provide a healthy diet for everyone here today, we wouldn't be able to because we don't produce the right foods. We produce enough food, but not the right food. And so agricultural policy is supporting the production of food that's not contributing to health. That's a policy lock-in that requires international or national interventions. Maybe the bright spot that we've seen has been in municipal policy. And here we're seeing that cities, Los Angeles, New York, Ghent, Copenhagen, have been extremely proactive in trying to create policy environments that improve access to and availability of healthy and sustainably produced foods. And that really is, again, beginning to respond to consumer demand, but also to citizenry who wants to live in an environment that is agreeable, attractive, affordable, diverse, and provides access to healthy and sustainable foods and reduces the healthcare costs for these communities while contributing to environmental protection. So those are a bit some of the first early reactions in terms of what kinds of policy changes are required or would be required to help us make this transition.
Great. And, you know, policy is a tricky thing, and I know a lot of the big buzzword today is ecosystem, right? And so I would throw it out to the group. What kind of an ecosystem needs to be built, and where are the bright spots in the ecosystems today, as well as the challenges in terms of informing policy that can actually drive change?
So in my context, I see three large groups of stakeholders. The first is the research community. So not only academia, but think tanks and national, regional, and international research institutions. And what we're seeing is that enough of them are not working together, both in the health space and the agriculture space. And then we also are seeing a challenge around demand-driven, data-driven policymaking, where private sector and the government is relying on these research institutions to actually generate the work, the information to shape what they do. The second group of stakeholders are really what I call champions. And you need those champions in government at the federal, the local, the state level, and the regional and international level. And then the third piece are the financiers. And they are really the ones who can provide catalytic funding and take risks that many private entrepreneurs don't want to take. With both of the organizations I'm involved in, if we didn't have catalytic financing, it would be tough to take risks, to innovate, to change mindsets, and to transform lives, because that funding is required, and it has to be patient capital. If it's capital that requires change in the short term, you're not going to see that happen. And unfortunately, those systems are not connected, and in many of our regions, they are quite fragmented. I don't know if France has a more cohesive system But in Nigeria, we have 23 research institutions just in agriculture. And we have over 60 universities. Rarely do we see them working together to transform the sector so that the private entrepreneurs can actually get involved and use that data to shape policy. And then the government is not relying on them to generate. So that type of free flow of information on a regular basis to ensure demand-driven policy making and policy making that's sustainable is really critical. Then the champions and the financiers also getting involved is also really important. And then you need the consumers, sorry. They're the fourth and probably
That
the
was my
most
next
important.
question, actually.
Yes, consumers, because ultimately, if there's no demand, then you can't have a market that works. So yeah, that's really important.
And I know, Thomas, you've been working on some research to understand how to engage and mobilize these stakeholders to help them understand, innovation at the end game of innovation is a value proposition. And I think sometimes we forget about that with the customers that we are engaging. So tell us a little bit about how you're kind of looking at connecting some of those dots and getting people to better understand and then obviously invest in the future.
Yeah, so I mean, you need awareness and you need understanding before you can have action. And so a big part of our work in Australia has simply been, over the last 18 months, helping key stakeholder groups, including government, understand how are these alternative proteins globally emerging, and then translating that to the Australian context to think about what does that mean for our businesses, our agricultural sector, science, etc. And you can advocate all you like for a particular future that you might believe in, but unless you have the evidence and the data and the arguments to back yourself up, you're not going to get very far. And so one piece of work we're doing at the moment with Deloitte Access Economics is a national economic assessment of the potential value of a plant-based meat sector in Australia, to actually say, okay, considering the global trends, considering Australia's positioning and strengths and challenges, what could this look like for us across 3 potential scenarios within a 10-year time frame? And then actually presenting that to government, to politicians, to investors, to startups as a tool, as a guide to understand where the opportunities are to engage. And I think that's a really important point. Often the answers are not the same for the entire globe. In most instances, they're very different. We have to consider the unique challenges, opportunities, and value propositions of each region and each market, and take those into consideration when we're looking to how to foster those ecosystems.
I know, Jack, that's one of your specialties, right? Taking all that amazing data and translating that into what do I do with that? So.
Well, I'd like to pick up on what was just said, because in some ways consumers have never cared more nor known less how their food is produced. And if you care passionately but you don't really understand the food system, you can ask for things that may make things worse. And one of the things that I've noticed today is that in many ways we've talked about the challenges and the problems of agriculture, and those are all true, but that's using today as our baseline. If we were to use 1980 as our baseline, in the United States we use 50% less water to produce a bushel of corn, 60% less erosion, 40% less greenhouse gas emissions. Every single thing is better. So if we use today as the baseline, though, then farmers are the problem to be solved. If we use 1980 as the baseline, farmers are the solution to our problems. Things are getting better, but are they getting better fast enough? That's a very different question than we need to fix the farm system. If you think about food and agriculture, 800 million people go to bed hungry today, but it's also the smallest percentage of people in the history of the planet. So the question isn't, are things bad and getting worse? They're good and getting better, but we can do better. We should do better. And I prefer a story of hope than one of doom and gloom, because I think that turns people off. And so just as we're thinking about it, the food system, it's the safest it's ever been in the history of the world as well. So I think that how we talk about it is really important, and how we communicate these issues is going to impact how people choose to respond.
I think those baselines are important, but on the other hand, and I think food is doing a lot better in many ways. As you've said, food safety, food access, total productivity. But we're also talking about food in a day and age where you have countries like Mexico and US, which 40% obesity, right? So that's not better. That's a whole lot worse than when we were. And we're also talking about, I mean, the reason we call this the Anthropocene is that the environmental variables that we're tracking are now measured at a planetary scale, right? In the 80s or 50 years ago, you didn't measure these at a planetary scale. You measured them at a local scale because they were local measures. But that the urgency and the critical nature of the message is because we're now seeing this impact at planetary scale, planetary measures. And so I think I agree, a lot of the technologies that we're seeing are reducing impact per acre in some cases, but definitely not rapidly enough. And there's some questions about what is it in the baseline that we're measuring, and it has to be more than sufficient calorie production in that baseline.
Yeah, I just think that if 90% of the farmers in the world are doing a bad job, that's not sending them a very good message. I think they're doing the best they can and they've done better every day. And so we need to give them credit for feeding us and help them to do a better job.
Yeah. All this is fascinating. The problem that we are all facing, I think we've just lived through that in France with the Yellowjacket Crisis. That is, you can have innovative solutions. If they are expensive for the poor, they will never work. So we've got to find food tech adapted to the poor people. We will always have 40% of lower middle class and poor people in our societies. I mean, not always. It can go to 30%, but it's not going to disappear. And these people are the obese people. Precisely because there's no other possibility for them than buying junk food. So we need to find cheap innovation, which means heavy industrial investments, because at the end of the day, it's all a question of critical mass of production. So you need a lot of money. You need a lot of money to build huge factories, to build the new products. But to build those huge factories, you need to be a little bit sure that they're going to find consumers. So that's where we are. So we have to test a lot of products and then be ready to massively expand the product lines to reduce the prices, the distribution prices for those people. That's the challenge.
I mean, so the tech part, what about in the Gilets Jaunes in France? I think is a great example of classic, highly ambitious environmental targets such as the ones that the Lancet recommends, but without enough thinking about how do we bring the farmer along? How do we transition, either whether it's a dietary transition towards healthy food or whether it's an innovation transition for farmers in France or in Africa? A lot of the tech that we talk about, I think, doesn't seem to be adapted to or fit for supporting smallholder farmers, medium-sized farmers, whether it's an information technology or an in-field technology. Could we see more innovation that is built for these communities, or are technical innovations going to be less apropos for those communities?
Well, yes, we can. But if you look at, for example, the decision taken by our government, which is to abandon glyphosate, you say? Yeah, in 2 years, which was perceived by the Greens in France as a capitulation. They wanted it to be abandoned immediately, and the farmers say, "Come on, guys! I mean, it's just impossible. It's impossible. Give us 4 years." So the consensus was on 2 years. It's going to be difficult. For that to be possible, you need to massively develop alternative tools and technologies, allowing the farmers to continue to work properly. And it's possible. But to deploy that, it's massive door to door. You have to go farm by farm. You have to explain, to test, to alleviate the fears, the global psychological work to be done with those hundreds of thousands of entrepreneurs can be done, provided you understand that it is massive door to door. It is not just the publication of a law and some PowerPoints and a show on TV. It's not going to be enough. You have to go physically, door to door. So who does that?
Yeah, you're shaking your head, Ndidi. I want to hear.
No, I definitely agree. I think that oftentimes we set global policies here in the West and expect them to filter down and set very high bars for others who are just coming up the ladder to meet, which is not cost effective and not sustainable. And so the challenge is how we have bottom-up policy solutions that then meet halfway, and how we also understand that we need innovation to reduce the cost of adaptation, to reduce the cost of change, and to ensure that consumers can afford it. Even in the West, healthy food is more expensive than junk food. And so poor people, I know the United States better than I know Europe, poor people in the United States still eat junk food because it's cheaper. Similarly, my country, according to the World Economic Forum, 57% of household income is spent on food. It's already extremely high, not only because the incomes are low, but because we're very dependent on imported food, because we've neglected our agriculture sector. And that creates a dichotomy. So you want people to move to more nutritious food when it's more expensive. So I think the onus and the sense of urgency right now for the food sector is how to innovate with the poor person in mind, not with the middle income one. How to innovate with that price point. And that price point has to be low, which is a challenge for us. Is it 50 cents? In my country, we often say it's 50 naira. That's the price point for innovation. So can you find an innovative snack or an innovative food that's 50 naira? 50 naira is the equivalent of 20 cents. So that is the mindset that you're utilizing when you're innovating food or when you're developing approaches and technology. And that has to be at the back of our mind all the time.
So money's finite, and it's not always democratic, right? So when you think about where the funding needs to be allocated in policy, I'm just curious the group's thoughts on it. There is, we've heard research or science policy, we've heard access policy, you know, to your point, making sure food is accessible. There is, you know, regulatory policy. What do you fund? What lever do you have to invest in and pull first for the rest to fall into place?
I'm a big fan of challenge funds. I don't know how many of you like challenge funds, but through our food company, we actually benefited from 2 challenge funds, which allowed us as entrepreneurs to take the risk, go down to the level of farmer, reduce. So we had to match funding that was provided by, and the first one was called Africa Diaspora Marketplace Competition that USAID offered in partnership with Western Union. And that was a little fund, but it was actually a government agency saying we're going to support Africans who want to go back and start businesses. And I've been trying to get the Australian government to do something similar, which is like a diaspora marketplace competition, get people to go back and start companies. There's the Africa Enterprise Challenge Fund, which the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Rockefeller Foundation started with DFID. So there are ways that governments can also start challenge funds to promote innovation. And that's what I've seen to work a little if you see that the company or the individual is willing to put their cash as well and their sweat equity into the pie. And that spurs private sector growth and development.
And you're nodding, and you've been building your mini ecosystems across your region of the world. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that funding that incentivizes collaboration and bringing together multiple key stakeholders to work on a challenge together can be really, really effective. And we're talking about very complex systems that we're trying to shift in very big ways, and so I think it's important to have engagement across the board. I also think it's important for governments to be thinking beyond the next election with these sorts of things and to be making decisions based on evidence and empathy, you know, understanding that there are going to be significant portions of people whose livelihoods might be tied to sectors or segments of sectors that are or becoming outmoded. And so how do we offer more opportunities and transitional pathways for those people and incentivize more young professionals coming into the sector to follow pathways of the future? The opposite of that, which we're seeing in some markets, is sort of protectionist, I guess, knee-jerk responses from those who benefit from the status quo, trying to influence governments and the development of policy, which is really unfortunate to see. And in fact, I think it's, you know, the claims that some of these bodies make about the emergence of new technology being a threat that should be feared and fought is not only inaccurate, it's irresponsible. I think they're doing a disservice to their constituents by not realizing that the future looks different than it does than the current system, and that we should be working towards that and looking at how can we be ahead of that curve and bring people along with us.
And Jack, I'd love to hear your thoughts too, especially when we're talking about, the more we talk, the heavier it gets, right? And as many challenges there are, it's also probably the most exciting opportunity and place we've ever been in food. And how do we kind of uplift that a little bit?
Well, I think one thing is that we should stop talking about good and bad, right and wrong, and we should start talking about choices and consequences. So Europe can choose not to use glyphosate, but a consequence is that you will replace it with more toxic herbicides, or you'll just have more weeds and less production. So, there's a choice, but there's a consequence. And one of the challenges we have is that what's good for your farm may not be good for your country. And what's good for your country may not be good for the planet. So the US and Europe, we both export about $150 billion worth of agricultural products. The top exports from the United States are corn, soy, and wheat. And the top exports from Europe are beer, wine, whiskey, and cheese. Now, I like my beer, wine, whiskey, and cheese. Anybody who knows me knows that. But, who's feeding the 99% and who's feeding the 1%? On the other hand, Europe imports 70% of its animal feed needs, and the country that sends the most food to Europe is Brazil. So Europe has exported its agricultural footprint for agriculture to the most biodiverse country on the planet. So it's not about good or bad, it's about choices and consequences. If Europe could produce more of the products it needs, then that would reduce the pressure on our rainforest. And so we need to look at opportunities as something that has potential to reduce those impacts, whether it's innovation or Brazil or Africa or other places. We need to be open to a diversity of solutions because there is no silver bullet.
I think that's a really important point, and the diversity of solutions that we're going to need to come up with. So when we talk about the lands, people say, so what's the solution? And I think any solution, any single solution at scale today, if you're feeding 10 billion, will become the next problem. I'm almost certain of that. And so I think this notion of having shared and aligned targets and having the macro policies, the international and the national policies that are aligned in terms of those outcomes is a first step in providing that solution, but they must be policies that allow for local innovation, culturally appropriate innovation, but that accelerate that change. I think this notion of no silver bullets, diversity of solutions, and a need for tremendous innovation is really right on.
I think we can also highlight the responsibility of the big companies, the big groups, because at the end of the day, you always have sort of fields of influence which are polarized on one or two big companies, and those companies can have more power than states. So, the difference between a company which has been conscientized and a company that has not been conscientized on the global ecosystem of subcontractors is so massive that we have to insist on that and be really conscious of that power, I would say. So, because without them, I don't see the governments really able to drive the change. We've done that in the past 2 years in France. There was something called les États généraux de l'alimentation, so it was the sort of food consensus building massive conference in all the territories and regions and then centralized to Paris and so forth. There were zillions of people contributed and so forth. At the end of the day, there is a law, but it's going to take so much time, and the price of the consensus is so high. We need the big groups to hold part of those reins.
I'm going to close out with a question because I think people may have some questions, but I find it fascinating that this conference for each of these panel sessions opens the session with a teenager. And I think one stakeholder group we haven't really talked about today was youth. And I'm just curious if you have a piece of advice for the young innovators, the young entrepreneurs, and just hopefully people who will see this live streamed, but what can the next generation do to help kind of move this forward and shape policy and, to your point, create the empathy and the excitement that we probably need moving forward?
They will force us to move. Fortunately, they are there. Driving force. You have children, all of you. So do they eat as much meat as you? It's no. They have started to reduce their meat consumption, huh?
I'd say engage quite actively in the debates and be extremely careful of categories. With the problems that we're faced with today, this really is about gradients. It's about understanding interactions, about being system thinkers. And there are dangers to categorical thinking. You know, we're seeing that in politics. But one example that I hear a lot of youth telling me, oh, I'm becoming vegan to protect the climate. This is an example of a solution that if you hypothetically scaled that up to the entire global population would cause another problem, right? You don't have organic agriculture without animals. Right? It's very difficult to have circular agriculture without animals. The most endangered ecosystems that we have on Earth aren't our tropical forests, they're our grassland biomes. There's only 20% of native grassland biomes remaining today. There's a role where animal agriculture could actually be contributing to conservation. I use that as an example just to say we need systems thinking, we need to be a bit nuanced in our thinking, and we need to avoid some of these categories. That's not to say, I'll back that up to say, it's not to say we don't need to reduce meat consumption in the West. We're consuming 600 times more than is recommended by our health, and it is a driver of loss of rainforest in the Amazon particularly. But there are ways of working on meat production that really can be beneficial. And so we need to be better about being nimble, about being educated, and about being able to speak to be interested in, and work on the nuances and gradients.
I agree with you definitely about systems thinking. I want to pick up on what he talked about, the role of large companies, especially the multinationals. I think they have a really important role to play because they have advertising spending money to advertise and they change mindsets. But I also want to caution that they should not have different policies for different parts of the world. So I'll use an example. Sugar. Sugar is already being taxed in Europe, but there's no sugar tax in West Africa. So you find Coca-Cola sugar use is much higher in West Africa. So they're creating a generation of young people. My kids want to drink soft drink every day. We call it soft drink, soda every day. It's higher concentration of sugar in West Africa than they're allowed to in other parts of the world. You see that with every single multinational. And I think starting from their headquarters, we have to hold them accountable to create a level playing field. Now, in terms of the youth, I think that it's really important to empower youth with information. So to ensure this systems thinking, they have to have information, not radical in one direction, but very balanced view of what is happening in the world and whose role it is. Because your country can be very well behaved in Europe, but then dump in another part of the world, which we're seeing in so many countries do. And that dumping is often happening in Africa because they're making a lot of money dumping substandard products with no checks and balances. And that has to stop. So you can celebrate your country for being such a leader in the climate change or sustainability movement, but it has to be a universal policy because human lives have value everywhere and there's no difference between an African child and a European child.
Well, as a young person, I turned 23 on Sunday. I encourage other people of my generation to think, to challenge inherited thinking. So much of the society in which we operate is based on inherited thinking, and so I would encourage people to think critically, but also with curiosity.
So I guess I'd like to focus on the hopeful note that we talk a lot about population growth, and obviously we're going from 7 to maybe 9 or 10 billion. But after 2050, population growth levels off extremely quickly. And that's because of 100% of population growth today is from people living longer, which is a good news story. So the challenge we have is not to do better every day forever. The next 30 years are not just the most important 30 years there have ever been in the history of agriculture. And they're the most important 30 years there will ever be in the history of agriculture. If we get to 2050 without cutting down our forests and draining our rivers, lakes, and aquifers, we are good forever. So this moment matters.
Well, we have 55 seconds left, so does anybody have a quick question?
From a student?
No questions. Guess you asked me. Oh, yes.
So I do believe governments have a role in seeding innovation. The explosion of technology in the United States was driven by government funding for basic research. So just want to hear your comments on that.
So I can quickly comment. I think in the United States, we spend about $100 billion on health, and it's about $1 billion to $2 billion on food and agriculture. Clearly not enough, since we're all eating food every single day. If you look back 30 years ago, the United States and USAID and other programs were investing heavily in agriculture and food around the world. They've cut almost all of that out. They've started a little bit again in the last 5 to 10 years, but not clearly enough. And so I think absolutely. I mean, the good thing is that food is sexy for the first time, and there's a lot more interest in innovating in this space. So I'm hopeful that governments are. The United States started FAR, the Foundation for Agricultural Research, where they've added a few $100 million in the last few years. So it's the beginning, it's not the end. Completely agree.
Yeah, I mean, even within food and agriculture, the funding that is currently offered to tax and cash incentives, which I think are a fantastic tool to be able to stimulate new innovation, mostly towards traditional industries. So how could we potentially transition some of that to supporting new systems and new products and technologies? One strategy that I think is actually really effective is playing on the fear of missing out by speaking to those nations that are doing it better than we are. And so for Australia, that's pointing to our neighbours in New Zealand across the ditch, and we have a friendly but competitive relationship with them. Countries like Singapore, I was just there speaking at the Disruption in Food Conference. Here's a country not limited by an existing animal agriculture sector, and so they just put $144 million on the table for new innovation, a big chunk of which is going towards alternative proteins. So I think pointing to examples of where it's being done well, and the fact that if we don't prioritise these sorts of areas, we risk losing out in the long term.
One word for France. So I think the amount of budget allocated to research is okay-ish, even if the salaries of the researchers are not high, very low, which is a problem. The problem is the translation of that money to startups. So the technology transfer to economy. It has remained historically quite, not only by the way in food tech and in the whole scope of science, to academic. So what we have decided to launch, it was last January, is a big, we call that deep tech plan, by which we want to create 2,000 startups in the next 3 years, out of the labs. You know, you take researchers with the white blues, you take the blues out, and you create entrepreneurs, which is a cultural change and shift, which is massive. That's another massive door-to-door, I can tell you. But we have decided to embark in that adventure.
Well, we are time's up. So thank you all. It was a fantastic conversation. We could go on for another hour, but wonderful job. Thank you all for being part of this.
Thank you.